Genomic deterioration. Atheists and creationists are both religious. Both atheists and creationists have the same problem, the existence of existence, the prime reality problem, the initial cause of everything. Nobody on earth completely understands it. There is an element of mystery, a religious component to the whole thing, no matter which way you look at it from. Before Darwin, it seemed obvious to virtually everyone that the great functional complexities of life must have been created by God. Since Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution, more people than ever, since previous to that time, have ardently advocated that Darwinian evolution was the actual creator of the complexities of biology, and therefore no need for an intelligent creator, who, perhaps because of the second law of thermodynamics, would require a greater explanation for how such a presumably more complex, intelligent creator could possibly exist, which was not the simple explanation that they wanted. So some scientists prefer to believe that Darwin solved that big problem, how the sophistication within the various species of life arose, that it would have evolved gradually over millions of years, from the simplest possible life form, and so they propose that it is reasonable to assume that the first life, minimal life, also naturally arose from simplicity, and perhaps even the universe did as well. And so such people might reason that the Darwinian explanation therefore serves as a parable, that teaches us, that just because we can't explain the origin of life, or the origin of the regular fine-tuned laws of physics, Darwin showed us that it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no naturalistic explanation for those other problems, and, indeed, because some people actually still do believe that Darwin's theory of evolution has solved the problem of how life's various designs were created, they therefore argue that instead of smuggling magic into our explanations, instead of saying that God did it, we are better off having faith that scientists will do the hard work, and perhaps, eventually, in the future, solve those other problems as well, finding a naturalistic, evolutionary explanation for their creation. Of course, that parable only works if Darwinian evolution is the right explanation, in the first place, for the origin of all species, all life forms. But, some annoyed evolutionists like to downplay the fact that, as time has gone by, there has been an ever-increasing number of scientists who claim that this so-called Darwinian synthesis of increasing complexity is just a modern-day myth, and doesn't stand up to proper scientific scrutiny at all. If these particular scientists are correct, and Darwinian evolution is not the right explanation for the creation of all different life forms, then the aforementioned parable collapses, and Darwin hasn't really taught us all that much at all. And saying that God did it might not necessarily be wrong, after all. So what are some of the reasons that are making these scientists doubt natural evolution as an explanation for the creation of biological complexity? Might there be reasons to doubt the Darwinian worldview? Yes, it seems that Mother Nature herself might be totally against the idea. It's what scientists call the entropy problem. The second law of thermodynamics says, our physical existence depends upon the fact that everything tends to decay toward a maximum, and then whatever it has decayed into, that decay product also decays into something else even further down the thermodynamic gradient, and so on and so forth, from order to disorder, toward a state of highest probability. If it didn't all happen that way, not only would scientists all be out of work, but there would be no arrow of time, no ordered sequence of causality, no consistency, no natural regularity where cause always precedes effect, and we would not exist. Evolutionists hypothesize that the genetic codes of life are somehow different, that there exists a Darwinian synthesis, that natural selection of genetic mutations perhaps can somehow naturally evolve them into something better and better sometimes, instead of getting worse all the time, through successive generations. But can the copying mistakes of the codes embedded in the DNA molecules really ever turn out to be increased organizational complexity for nature to then select? How many degenerative mutations would there have to be for every lucky progenerative one, to the extent that such mutations of this speculated increased functional complexity might even happen at all? And what prevents Mother Nature from allowing many of the degenerative mistakes to accumulate over successive generations? It seems all the luck in the world is not going to prevent that from happening, and therefore, all the natural selection in the world, all the Darwinian processes, are going to gradually destroy all the complex functionality of life. Everything will gradually go extinct. This genetic deterioration, a continuous increase of genetic entropy in all life, with its prediction of the total extinction of it all, and a somewhat naturalistic prediction at that, principally is a good plausible theory for science. No matter how objectionable it might sound to some people, it meets the falsifiability standard, and it is experimentally testable, with overwhelming verification, observably happening right now, manifestly in front of those who want to scientifically investigate it, and the only reason that some people will not consider it is emotional, either because it might make the future seem bleak, or because it seemingly points to God, to something supernatural and perhaps beyond any further scientific investigation, being necessary for how in the past it all began, in a more organized state, and since then has degenerated, and is still degenerating for all of us to see. And the remaining question perhaps is that of, either a deistic or theistic God. Put your emotional cognitive dissonance aside. Be as exclusively logical as you can, and consider the science, consider what nature herself is telling us. And be humble enough to admit that the prime reality, the uncreated creator, the hypothetical ultimate prime mover, whether intelligent or not, is a concept that might elude the physical cognitive limitations of the human brain, and might only ever be a well-reasoned faith-based argument, of which an intelligent designer appears to be the far more likely original cause, when extrapolated from the observable one-way direction of change in the universe. This natural law of degeneration and decay distinguishes the one-way direction of time, the only direction we perceived that time is always flowing forward. Everything is aging, things are getting older, all the time. It is, at the most physically detectable fundamental level, the only scientifically discernible direction of natural change, in the entire, known, universe. Strangely, there are some people, out there, who don't want to believe that this is, or was, always the case. They imagine, as part of a cosmological hypothesis, that perhaps at some other time, or maybe some part of the universe we can't observe, the direction of change might go, or might have gone, the opposite way, that everything would always be getting younger. What we call the super unlikely would be the rule, and that which is overwhelmingly probable would virtually never happen, so that the arrow of time would be opposite to what we always experience in life, even though it sounds logically absurd and ridiculous. Some people speculate, and a significant portion among them even believe, that specified complexity and functionality can somehow arise naturally from non-specification, and non-functionality from randomness. But there have always been people who postulate against what appears most reasonable and consistently observable, seemingly silly ideas. How do we filter out those wrong ideas from the facts? Can science alone do it, or is something else also necessary? If you are not only interested in intellectual exercises, engaging in them just to fuel your ego, but instead, you are humble and interested in getting closer to truth, then consider the following. Down through human history, there have been ideas about the origin of the world. Many believed in supernatural deities who had created and produced it. Others philosophically postulated that the world had somehow generated itself from non-existence, and then there were those who thought that the world was perhaps past eternal or self-existent. Some believed in an interventionist God who was involved in the goings-on of things in the world. Others thought that the evil and suffering in the world suggested that such an intelligent creator, God, either does not exist or is not interested in what goes on, is indifferent, and doesn't interfere. As it turns out, when it comes to both either hypotheses or belief systems, the situation is very similar today. In modern times, many people also believe in the existence of God, while others don't. When we reduce a particular aspect of religious ideas down, there are fundamentally actually only two main basic religious ideas in the world right now about how we came to exist. Both views are very religious. Both ideas of course contain many variations on at least one, and sometimes parts within both, of those two themes, but there are still essentially only two main themes, of which there are many subsets. One religious view is that everything that exists is material, natural, that everything was the result of unguided natural processes, that they were all the product of natural evolution. Some try to claim that this view is not religious, or superstitious, even though it obviously is. The other, more traditional religious idea, is that a supernatural self-existent intelligent designer God is ultimately the creative cause of all existence. Which of these two religious ideas is more superstitious, in disagreement with natural evidence? There is no third option for religiosity. No third possibility. Fundamentally it can only logically be one of those two, either intelligent design or just pure natural processes only. Both views claim to be supported by science. What kind of sciences are we talking about? The real question, in all of this, is, can science distinguish which idea is false, not relying on confirmation bias? Can natural evidence give us an empirical handle on what came before? Where does the natural evidence point? Where do the consistently reliable natural processes point us to? Which ideas disagree with repeatable experiment? And are there other ways, apart from traditional science, that can help us make such distinctions? Is science not the only way that we can investigate this? How is this something rather than nothing? We don't even know exactly how to describe what a thing actually is. What is it made of? More things. What are those things made of? Things, again. Where does it stop? How far down does that tower of turtles actually go? What ultimately is a thing? Something as opposed to nothing. What does that actually mean exactly? We don't completely know. What scientists do know a lot about now is how these so-called things behave. And we know how we don't ever, perhaps yet, seem to observe them behaving, and are therefore reasonably confident that they probably never have behaved that way in the past either, although no human today can be absolutely certain. Some people think that such ludicrous improbabilities cannot be totally ruled out scientifically, and that therefore this kind of highly probable superstition within the scientific domain can still be justified, on some level. For instance, some people believe that it is sometimes possible for living organisms to evolve to greater functional complexity over successive generations, even though the only direction of change yet observed by humans actually happening has been in the opposite direction, that of deterioration. Okay, so we have one bunch of people who, despite what has been seen, still believe, somewhat superstitiously, in certain processes existing in nature yet not seen. Another set of humans think that the overwhelming amount of repeatable experimental evidence and experience is sufficient to conclude that this is never the way nature runs, but things begin more ordered, and then deteriorate, and therefore, it appears very much so, somewhere very early in the processes that intelligent design was required. It seems, and this is of course only speculation, that there might be two main different types of people who are scientists. One of those types of people might be of the view that after narrowing an investigation down to the smallest of particles, for example, establishing the constraints experimentally by using expensive particle colliders and so forth, they would say that unless we can go down further, smaller, then we have to assume, perhaps for scientific purposes, actually for philosophically reductionist theoretical purposes, trying to simplify matters, that such a smaller domain doesn't exist, and just say that we've reached the bottom level of physical reality, the simplest fundamental level. Then there might be those other people who say that, in the level that we have uncovered, the specificity, regularity, and complexity of all those precise natural laws, is an indicator of something far greater further down, something far smaller and more sophisticated, far more specified and precise, underlying what we have discovered, that there is something else going on in all of it that cannot be detected in any other way at present. And these kinds of people would be open to the idea that perhaps there might be a God, an intelligent creator, after all. That doesn't necessarily mean that they believe in God's existence, but, as intellectually honest scientists who are diligent adherents to free open inquiry, they remain open-minded to the possibility. This is in stark contrast to those who might dismiss such a question out of hand. But is this all mere speculation, or do such people, as described, exist? It seems that both those types do. We need to ask some very deep philosophical questions about the way we do science, and the reasons why we do it. Some scientists are understandably uncomfortable with the idea of a supernatural creation by God, because, if that is true, it may be beyond the reach of science to provide a naturalistic explanation of exactly how the existing world really began more ordered and specified. So how would it affect the scientific enterprise? Would it make it less meaningful, or would the intelligent design theory, a possible intelligent designer of nature, boost science, if true, when studying the complexity, the specificity of various phenomena, and the pinpoint accuracy of the natural laws? Indeed, science would not be possible if the universe did not have this kind of complex order. Some people think this apparent fine-tuning of the universe to be deeply mysterious, and quite disturbing. Committed atheists, for example, certainly don't like that rather interesting deduction, but they appear to be irrational, emotional, and not logical. When doing science, what are we uncovering? Only mere fortuity, or are we backward engineering what was the incredible genius of a supernatural mind? Should we allow ourselves to ask that question, or do we exclude it from our investigation? The universe appears very smooth and relatively simple at the largest scales, and seems to us humans simple at the smallest measurable scales too, but, in between, there is, undeniably, very great complexity. Some speculate that this might, somehow, one day, provide a clue to how the integrated, functional, and irreducible complexities of life systems might have been created. And some of those people say, created only naturally, not intelligently. But, what has real science, actually, shown us? Could the types of complexities in living things ever arise only due to natural processes, somewhere along the way toward universal maximum entropy? All true scientists acknowledge that the universe overall is statistically going down, from a condition of more order, toward a condition of highest probability, disorder, disorganization, total heat loss, and therefore the theoretical heat death of the universe, meaning that the available heat will die, because the universe will continue to decay, until the maximum possible state of coldness, seemingly inevitably, eventuates, according to how we define and measure heat. Even if you believe that there might be exceptions to this overall rule, within this universal framework, perhaps in biology where incredibly unlikely rare kinds of statistical anomalies might be possible and perhaps selectable by nature for preservation and replication, It makes no difference whether you are an atheist or not when dealing with the natural laws, that when backward extrapolated point to the question of a much warmer, more organized, specified and functional beginning of the universe's existence. This question, for science, is inescapable, but the different answers to it, however, all contain various amounts of incredulity and faith. And therefore the best we can hope for from this is an inference to the best explanation of the known facts, of which there aren't as many as what you might first think. So after all of that, we are left with degrees of the plausibility for different explanations of it all, based on the laws of probability, and our uniform and repeated experience of the natural world. And this is all we ever see happening. So if, in your mind, the probability is established above 99.9% in favor of intelligent causation of this more organized, more complex beginning, then what is there actually left to talk about? If God did it, would that be a science stopper? Or would it add more meaning to the ongoing process of open inquiry? Everything that we know of, as far as we can tell, begins existing in a more ordered, specified, organized, and functional condition, and, from there, goes down, decays. In fact, this has been the proven case for every observable beginning. It is an indisputable law of nature. Why then do some people insist on superstitiously believing that the beginning of the universe and the beginning of life on this planet started in a simpler condition, and somehow naturally got more complex? Something that has never been observed happening definitively in front of anyone's eyes. So believe whatever you want about what the fossil record tells us. Put whatever interpretation on its so-called punctuated equilibrium and Cambrian explosion that you like, but take all those interpretations with a grain of salt, or at the very least open-minded skepticism. Let's give far more serious attention to the operational scientific method itself, what we can empirically distinguish, the scientifically proven facts, instead of just hypothetical models and belief systems only based on cherry-picking and confirmation bias. What is the true nature of evolution, especially biological evolution? What do we know to be true? What don't we yet know? And what ideas, so far by science, have been shown to be false? Hugo de Vries, a Dutch botanist, who lived from February 21, 1848, to May 21, 1935, was one of the first geneticists. He independently discovered the laws of heredity in the 1890s, unaware of Gregor Mendel's work. He is also said to have introduced the term mutation into the field of biology. He wrote a book, Species and Varieties, Their Origin by Mutation, 1904, The Open Court Publishing Company, Chicago, pages 5 and 6. He is possibly most renowned for the saying, "Natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest." So this phrase identified the major gap in evolutionary theory, and this catchphrase has become popular and repeated by many biologists. Innovations either get preserved or eliminated by natural selection, but natural selection, survival of the fittest, cannot create them, as far as we know. Therefore it seems evolution theory does not currently provide us with a satisfactory explanation of those origins. Actually, De Vries stated, at the time, that it was a term chosen lately by Mr. Arthur Harris in a friendly criticism of his views. James Arthur Harris, who lived from 1880 to 1930, was also a botanist, who worked at the Carnegie Institution and the University of Minnesota. His colleagues published a volume in his memory, J. Arthur Harris, Botanist and Biometrician, in 1936. Apparently, he was, in turn, roughly quoting Jacob Gould Sherman, who lived from 1854 to 1942. Sherman's books included The Ethical Import of Darwinism, 1887, Belief in God, Its Origin, Nature, and Basis, 1890, and Agnosticism and Religion, 1896. In his book, the ethical import of Darwinism. One of his stated goals was to distinguish between science and speculation, in the application of Darwinism to morals. A few pages after explaining this, he stated, "The survival of the fittest, I repeat, does not explain the arrival of the fittest." So it was obvious, even way back in those days, that scientifically, we can distinguish that natural selection eliminates the most undesirable of traits from living things, meaning that the most lethal traits of course don't survive, and anything beyond that is mostly speculation. New functional, more complex novel traits have never been observed coming into existence via natural selection, because we know that it is a subtractive process. Something else is needed. So what might account for all the complexity observable now? Is there a natural mechanism that can produce biological complexity? Has anyone ever seen it happen? Or are we crossing over into the realm of religiosity, or perhaps even superstition? One critical fact that bears mentioning is that these particular authors of course wrote such things long before the discovery of DNA, and had very little inkling of just how complex genetic information actually is. This information certainly was not available to Darwin. Now, in our time, we are privileged to live in a time where science has at least begun to reveal the grandeur, order, and unfathomable complexity of the genetic code, and some of its incomprehensibly sophisticated and intrinsically associated functions. Unfortunately, science has discovered a lot of problems associated with it, imperfections within this system, and so, since the discovery of DNA code, mutations have now been shown to be far more problematic than first thought. They are in fact malfunctions, duplication errors, damage, effectively decay, continually occurring and increasing within such systems. In the past, some contended that perhaps the DNA code is not really specified at all, that this idea was somehow just an illusion, that it was all ultimately higgledy-piggledy. But since the mapping and sequencing of the human genome, it would seem nobody believes that idea anymore. And therefore, instead, it becomes far more justifiable to view genetic mutations as another form of increasing entropy. Neo-Darwinists of course don't like this, because it conflicts with their ideology, the cult of Darwinism. But these discoveries about DNA are facts, and facts don't care about anyone's feelings. Subsequently, now in the Neo-Darwinist era, the ideology of mutationism is manifestly in contradiction to the known scientific facts. And, that major gap in the evolution theory has only widened, because the survival of DNA does not explain the arrival of DNA, and the survival of DNA code does not explain the arrival of DNA code. And it even gets much worse for the mutationists than that. Somatic mutations, alterations in DNA that occur after conception. Somatic mutations can occur in any of the cells of the body, except the germ cells, sperm and egg, and so these particular types of mutations, unlike the other types, are not passed on to children. These alterations can, but do not always, cause cancer or other diseases. From studying the aging processes of mammals, from humans to mice and giraffes, the mystery of why humans die at around 80, while other mammals live far shorter or longer lives, may finally have been partially solved by scientists. It seems to partly explain why a 5-inch long naked mole rat can live for 25 years, about the same as a far larger giraffe which typically lives for 24 years. A recent study from the Wellcome Sanger Institute in Cambridge suggests the speed of genetic damage could be the key to survival, not necessarily the rate at which an organism burns through its energy, but with long-living animals a slower rate of DNA mutations, regardless of their size. It appears that an average number of mutations at the end of lifespan across species was around 3,200 mutations. Which seems to indicate that there is a critical mass of genetic errors that can be reached after which the bodies of mammals are unable to correctly function, regardless of the age they had reached. So when it comes to all those somatic mutations, it seems that this particular set of genetic entropy accumulates at different rates for different organisms, including particular rates for humans. People can witness the results of that happening well within a human lifetime. But what about the type of mutations that are passed on to children? How do they affect the evolution of a population or species of organisms over time, over sequential generations? Does this type of genetic entropy also accumulate? Do these inheritable types of mutations, germline mutations, continually increase in total number, as each newer generation of children is born, degrading and eventually destroying the genome of a population, that is, causing the overall health of such a group to decay toward inevitable extinction? Many scientists, including population geneticists, now think so, while many Neo-Darwinian evolutionists are continually trying to find a natural way out of this empirically based logical problem. But why? Neo-Darwinian believers of a naturally caused, upward evolution, materialist-evolutionists, some of them make the extraordinary, anti-scientific claim. They say that their ideas about Darwinian evolution do not violate the entropy law, what they have imagined to be an evolutionary possibility of somehow increasingly specified and functional complexity in biology, from only unguided, unplanned, natural processes. They want to believe that natural selection is not only a process of elimination or preservation, but that natural selection of a certain kind of genetic mutations, duplication mistakes, can also somehow be a force for creating and increasing the functional complexity of life, biology. They will quite often state it directly, and perhaps might display a few fossils or bones, and imaginative artists' impressions or convoluted diagrams, maybe even quoting from others in authority who are committed to similar beliefs, while they are saying it. And how they manage to keep a straight face while doing that is truly incredible. Although it's an interesting hypothesis, calling it a proven fact is just wrong. It's rather reprehensible when they make such statements without honestly acknowledging, to the layperson, the only true and proven direction of change in the universe, downward decay. So what they say is misleading to the general public. This, as it might seem to many scientists, is hand-waving and shamefully obvious. It's disgraceful. In reality, they are just parroting off what others, who are committed to the atheist Darwinian worldview, have taught them, or relaying it from someone higher up in the chain of the speculative information transfer, generated from a falsely imagined materialist perspective, in actuality, ironically in contradiction to such a perspective if it were truly empirical. And maybe many of them believe it, and perhaps have not given it the sufficient scrutiny that it deserves. But this is intellectual laziness. They have not done their homework. They have unwittingly allowed themselves to become indoctrinated with an overly narrow definition of what entropy actually is. They have not considered what should have otherwise been to them the obvious implications of it, a more ordered, possibly intelligently organized beginning to everything, and, perhaps unintentionally, have inadvertently lied to you. Perhaps in some cases, it might be intentional, who knows? Make of that what you will. Whatever the case, the only scientifically proven truth that has ever been demonstrated from experiments and observations is that Darwinian evolution goes down, lessening the complexity, not up, when any direction of change is able to be either measured or mathematically calculated. If you are told something different, it is not science, but ideology, being dogmatically imposed upon you. You must see it for what it is. In effect, you are being taught just another alternative religious belief system, but it is not based on repeatable experimental evidence, therefore it is a rather incompetent belief system, because it is neither really based on any distinctive operational scientific data nor any definitive mathematical logic either, nothing significant that distinguishes itself from the overwhelmingly opposing evidence. Therefore, in effect, it is a superstition. One owes it to themselves not to be fooled by this brazen ignorance of the experimentally distinguishable facts. And so it is self-evident why you can break it all down overall into simply two worldviews. One worldview, the materialist worldview, a hypothesis, and even a belief for some people, is the idea that things started simple, and then might have, for some unknown reason that has never been experimentally demonstrated, somehow progressively gotten more specified, complex, and organized, over time, only from blind, unguided, natural processes, natural selection being the most commonly touted, and genetic mutations, and so on. The other worldview is that the world in some sense started out highly ordered, organized, and perfect, intelligently created, and then corruption entered a part of the system, as far as humans are concerned, and things have since then degenerated, and are still, running down, deteriorating, especially the human race, all from observable processes that can be experimentally demonstrated, which is basically one interpretation of the biblical worldview. There are many other worldviews in between these two polar opposites, both various religious views, and so-called non-religious views which are not religious at least in the more traditional sense, but actually, they are manifestly religious in their own various ways. And, ultimately, there is no escaping it. So scientifically we want to try and deduce which worldview has more or less degrees of superstition than the other, that is, not only notions about the supernatural, but also, distinguishing possible naturalistic superstitions, by examining ideas about nature in the present time that either agree or disagree with experiment. Not untestable, ad hoc excuses, such as appealing to lots of time, nor an imagined multiverse of infinite actualities, but some observably real phenomena that can be subjected to scientific experimentation. There are currently natural laws and regularities that seemingly cannot be broken or violated, which legitimizes science. One that has sometimes been the most contentious of them is the second law of thermodynamics, an apparent law that has never been found wrong, under any circumstances. Does it therefore also apply to genetic codes, even over vast time scales? It seems highly likely. Creationists generally believe that, while evolutionists do not want to. But it has always agreed with experiment, and all relevant observations. While there are a lot of anecdotal viewpoints on both opposing sides about what the fossil evidence and the DNA evidence represent, the experimental evidence is very definitively in favor of the creationist view, at least in this one regard. Scientists are most certainly witnessing degeneration, in some populations and family groups. These are facts, not confirmation bias, and however which way we might feel about it doesn't change anything. To ignore this evidence is to be unscientific, even anti-scientific. In cosmology, there is the past hypothesis, that, according to the second law of thermodynamics, the universe began existing in a more organized state. Science points us that way, but it cannot ultimately say how, nor why it all began that way, a fact that might possibly remain beyond the reach of science, and only be subject to well-reasoned faith-based explanations, if any. It is sometimes advised in the physical sciences to explain concepts in the simplest possible terms that a layperson would understand. This, however, is often a far more difficult challenge when explaining biological systems. Simple explanations often don't suffice. Biology is so complex that it remains mostly beyond human understanding, and an honest scientist would not delude oneself into thinking otherwise. Even what can be explained cannot avoid complicated descriptions by necessity. In fact, oversimplification can actually be misleading in such cases. For instance, Simply saying that natural selection is a non-random process that can somehow drive evolution uphill is grossly oversimplified and misleading. That view should be regarded as obsolete. It is far more complicated than that, and now with a better scientific understanding of thermodynamics, DNA, and molecular machinery in biology, no good intellectually honest biologist would delude themselves into believing that idea anymore. Such overly simple explanations are evidently wrong. A simple explanation is not necessarily the required most possibly achievable fundamental description of a phenomenon for science, but a lot better description is often required to understand a system in a more satisfactory manner, although most often never fully achievable. Hundreds of years ago, people could have been excused perhaps for superstitiously believing in spontaneous generation of life from non-life, such as maggots, coming from rotten meat, for instance, until Louis Pasteur and others scientifically disproved those ideas. Likewise, people perhaps in more recent times gone by, without our modern scientific knowledge now, might have first thought that living things violate the entropy law when seeing them get conceived, develop into something that seems more complex, and after getting born, again grow into something that might first seem more complex than how it started. But nowadays, with more scientific enlightenment, we know of course that this is actually not the case, because obviously the highest complexity was already written in the genetic code when the organism was first conceived. Without genetic code, without the embryo, without the highly specified initial conditions within the fertilized cell, all the subsequent specified complex development would be impossible. We now take this knowledge for granted. So you would think that all scientists had stopped this type of foolish anti-entropic superstition by now, in all things to do with all types of natural evolutionary processes. Unfortunately, you would be wrong. Of course, we are using the word scientists very loosely in this particular instance. Scientists, out of professional necessity, are supposed to be skeptical. But some evolutionists claim to believe that if natural selection is in the process, then somehow the law of increasing entropy might not always prevent the naturally caused evolution of life from going uphill, from naturally increasing its functional complexity. However, virtually every real scientist acknowledges the established truth that there are certain situations where evolution can only go downhill. Actually, all observed or measured situations, specifically, never uphill when constrained within various out-of-equilibrium closed systems, such as either where there isn't any extra available energy from outside a system, or where no useful information or no intelligently directed reorganization from outside a system can be made available and fed into the system, regardless of whether it is left to chance or natural selection in the case of biological systems. It is scientifically confirmed true that when an out-of-equilibrium system is closed is where entropy will then always increase toward a maximum, but never decrease. But such evolutionists then claim that this is not the case if a system is open to receiving available energy from outside of it. Without specifying the type of open system, they wrongly equivocate non-biological, open systems receiving available energy, causing them to go more out of equilibrium, with their claim that in open, biological ecosystems, the not properly explained overall entropy, perhaps a speculative junk DNA, within the biological mechanisms might somehow decrease, perhaps effectively serendipitously creating a greater amount of functional genetic codes and mechanisms in some way, all supposedly possible because energy was available and infused, and imagined only from chance, to somehow give nature something more complex and sophisticated to select for survival. Then these evolutionists say that, therefore, biological evolution might go uphill, via some speculative yet unexplained very lucky accidents, increasing its functional complexity overall by natural selection. However, this reasoning is wrong. Scientifically it is a non sequitur. Here is the manifest incompleteness of their argument and the disregarding of known fundamental truths. If you haven't spotted these already, this is the problem. There are differences between these two notions of entropy decreasing and entropy reversing. One is true and the other is false. And somewhere in between these two concepts the evolutionists hope that something out of the ordinary might occasionally happen, some unproven hypothetical incredibly rare kinds of happy accidents. Nonetheless, the entropy principle applies at every level. They wrongly conflate available energy with the more fundamental particles, and have not sufficiently accounted for the informational bits, some of which can include those specified bits within the functional complexities of biology. In other words, these two ideas, the scientifically established notion of feeding available energy into a functional complex system for it to then use, and the unnatural anti-scientific fanciful superstition, that of entropy fundamentally reversing, are two concepts containing great differences. Either available energy or intelligently created specified information certainly can be fed in, or infused into, an open system, thus increasing the so-called order. In that way, more specifically, either more energy affecting greater density differences, or more usable functional information affecting better specificity, within a system. But, within any system known to science, every classical macroscopic thing in some sense goes toward the future, not the past, and as far as we know maybe every smallest thing too, in that not only do things age, actually decay, but all the individual fundamental particles don't ever reverse all their speeds in unison, like in a movie film run backward. The atoms never all at once reverse to their previous positions, which therefore means that whatever the thing is, that they are all part of, it cannot return to its previous, more organized, state, but instead can only have a continuous degenerative change over time toward maximum disorganization. So entropy can never be reversed by nature alone, ever, nor by any other known way from human efforts has it ever been fundamentally possible. Entropy can be decreased, but not reversed. They are not the same thing. You can't even unscramble an egg, and you certainly cannot reverse the positions of every atom, in anything at all. The irreversibility of entropy is conceptually more fundamentally irreversible than simply increasing the overall available energy or even genetic information to any open system, and this still by itself most certainly does not demonstrate it is possible for biological systems to naturally evolve more functional specified complexity. However, evolutionists, even though they correctly acknowledged the scientifically accurate possibility of usable available energy or specified information feeding into open systems to effect a positive utilization by an already existing function, also, unfortunately against all empirical science, they want to blindly believe that the mathematically explained and empirically irrefutable irreversibility of entropy has nothing of any consequence to do with their claimed belief in a questionable blind naturalistic uphill evolution, namely, within the specified genetic information systems and molecular machinery of biology. Therefore, their apocryphal story asserts, nature might be able to select from these imagined accidentally organized functional complexities, supposedly serendipitously increased complexities according to atheists, only naturally created and surviving for subsequent replication, effectively preserved. And they make this equivocated, conflated, extraordinary claim, overlooking that it's the specificity of systems that actually degrade, that differentiation and specificity is from where the concept of entropy itself is distinguished, and ignoring the inconvenient truth that nobody yet known has ever observed such an unguided statistically progressively upward direction of change continually toward states of ludicrously extreme improbability, so implausibly unlikely where the known combinatorial possibility spaces are not only astronomical but quite often vastly astronomically many times beyond astronomical, such a coincidence not observed even once let alone many times, neither happening in any observable part of the universe nor happening anywhere within any measurable biological system. certainly not in a sufficient way that can demonstrate a sufficient natural mechanism capable of producing the smallest known microscopic life forms right up to the entire wide range of even more complex organisms that exist. Nor naturally anywhere else in a natural evolutionarily upward direction, but, so far as often revealed by scientific experiment, not only impossible but instead empirically opposite, manifestly downhill, moving toward maximum disorder, in the real observable world, that which is measurable, perceptible, discernible, and irrefutable, unassailable. And so it appears that these evolutionists are deliberately ignoring the scientific facts, and are manifestly superstitious. They seem to be cognitively dissident that they cannot experimentally demonstrate their uphill idea, but only microevolutionary heredity and decay. Therefore, sometimes born from willful ignorance, nonetheless, this inadequately thought up Neo-Darwinian contrivance is scientifically unjustifiable and manifestly wrong, fundamentally wrong. And so that is why, ironically, committed evolutionists, both atheists and ideologically driven Neo-Darwinists, religiously believing in what some view as such a vast naturalism of the gaps, so incredibly large, will try ad hoc to rescue similar ideas, claiming that, in an open system like our Earth, the sun's energy, or perhaps even the Earth's geothermal energy at the bottom of the deepest oceans somewhere, can somehow fuel an inadequately imagined spontaneous creation of life from non-life and subsequent creation of new species and higher life forms of exceedingly greater sophistication, that this influx of solar energy, or whatever the energy source happens to be, they imagine might somehow make it possible to overcome the statistical mechanics of natural downward unguided change toward disorganization and decay, and, by the natural selection of unsubstantiated assumed increased functional complexity of genetic information, somehow improve and build new molecular machinery. The machinery intrinsic to biology. This also has never been demonstrated experimentally, but in fact disagrees with experiment, and therefore highly questionable, actually refutable, from such experiments. And so the last line of defense for this unsubstantiated just so story, is, to suggest that vast amounts of time beyond human lifespans is needed for it, to create distinguishable measurable amounts of imagined added or increasing complexity, or improved differences, and therefore this ad hoc excuse, of requiring longer than human timescales, they might hope, might not be falsified, and thus some atheists might perhaps imagine that they have protected their willful disbelief of the possibility that an intelligent creator, God, exists. But the Darwinistic story, this extraordinary claim, is not a satisfactory naturalistic gap filler at all, because it is not only unsubstantiated but also disproven, experimentally falsified, in that numerous times, the true, actually demonstrated, natural processes, are consistently revealed by experimental science to be the exact opposite of that Darwinian belief system. So this so-called gap has already been filled with evolution consistently observably running in the opposite direction, contrary to what evolutionists were hoping to see. The scientific evidence has already spoken. So, it is bad enough that materialist evolutionists engage in naturalism of the gaps arguments, but even worse is that they attempt to fill those gaps with speculative, anti-entropic, uphill, gap fillers, which is anti-scientific, and therefore manifestly in the domain of superstition. The idea of no God existing, no intelligent creator, and everything, including you and me, is ultimately pointless, just a big, complex accident of nature, no hope, no loving God, and no eternal future for anyone. And one might suspect that such false, unscientific teachings have not only driven some people into a nihilistic philosophy but also, sometimes, suicide. This is not only reprehensible but also very, very sad. Why do some atheists want to impose such an irrational, horrible, and unscientific idea that disagrees with experiments on the public, An idea that experiments have completely demonstrated is wrong, something that we never see, the observable order somehow naturally arising from absolute chaos. And for science or any other practical purpose, such an idea is fruitless. When discussing the entropy problem, you have to be more specific about which systems you are defining, so as not to make loose statements about it. When trying to defend their anti-entropic nonsense arguments, some evolutionists make the category error of confusing the second law with the first law of thermodynamics. What they claim, as entropy reversal, is simply only energy conservation, and that is all. Saying that the Earth is an open system because the sunlight is always pouring onto it and therefore the total entropy is kept down, is like saying that if I put gasoline in my car, the total entropy of the car is kept down. But that is not true. Although you keep the fuel topped up in the car itself is still subject to wear, tear, and decay. And so it is with life on Earth, it is ultimately devolving. The macroevolution belief system is just science fiction, a superstition, the fanciful thinking of materialist atheists. Genetic decay is an observable phenomenon in the smaller isolated populations where there is a greater probability of inbreeding. What scientists never see is the opposite of this happening in biology. This much touted naturalistic hypothesis of uphill evolution has not been scientifically shown to be anything else except just fantasy, or mythology, because lots of time will not solve it. Science has shown us that time is destructive to all things. That's why we refer to things as aging, a statistical inevitability, an undeniable fact. The proper scientific attitude is, if you can cite some repeatable scientific experiment that definitively demonstrates the opposite, then be my guest. I'll change my mind, otherwise, I will stick with the facts, is the right way of looking at the problem, instead of some irrational desire to eliminate God from the big picture. In other words, those people, a specific set of evolutionists, are trying to conflate at least two different systems in their argument, as one. A system of energy and a system of information, a false equivocation. From this, some people might conclude, they unwittingly infer, that pouring more solar energy or geothermal energy into the system is just as good as infusing more specified information into the system, or that raw usable energy can somehow be transformed into genetic information along with a vast array of integrated molecular machinery, much of them codependent for their continued existence and replication, therefore part of an irreducible system, and all that choreography sophisticated enough to produce self-replication of the choreography itself, so that the abiogenesis idea is, for some inadequately imagined unknown reason, possible. If this is the case, they haven't really thought their idea through properly at all. It's utter nonsense. Actually, what they are trying hard to believe is that matter, energy, and the laws of nature can somehow create first life, and then from that, upwardly evolve higher life forms from some imagined unknown kind of genetic mistakes, with somehow accidentally improved genetic codes, better, more complex, biological mechanisms, so that then there would perhaps be a natural selection of those mistakes, and that this fancifully imagined process could continually happen on some level, somehow, despite the second law of thermodynamics, despite the inevitable forces of degeneration and decay, despite the scientific fact that genetic decay continually gets replicated and passed on, that it gets to be inherited by, inflicted upon, the next generation, deliberately ignoring the fact that information in general decays, and regardless of the irrefutable explanation that it all is underpinned by statistical mechanics, the process of increasing randomness, that everything tends to transform toward a condition of highest probability. And in this regard, it appears there are no other proven blind forces worth speaking about. It seems they desperately want to believe in the existence of undiscovered, upwardly creative statistical anomalies, and who knows what else, instead of God. due to the apparent implausibility of this idea, it seems that the macroevolution idea cannot account for the problem of evil, for if specified complexity cannot be created in this naturalistic way, then can we perhaps better understand how evil can develop? Maybe something, somewhere, has been overlooked by the evolutionists. The idea that evil is taught to be originally a desired intentional creation seems only to be a straw man argument that is often angrily exclaimed by committed atheists. However, given the apparent specificity of many things, there seems to be at least a couple of other possibilities. For one, evil looks like merely the consequences of the misuse of free will, and secondly, it also is perhaps the result of an actual observable proven type of evolution, the degenerative kind, decay. So, then, did the world begin beautifully and then somehow start to turn ugly? Or is there any chance at all that things can naturally get better? Could even the simplest known life form ever arise due to blind luck from only an amorphous plethora of disorganized chemicals? Well, consider this: something approximating the functional complexity of a prokaryotic cell scientifically appears to most likely be the simplest of all self-replicating machines logically possible within this physical universe. If this posited most minimal of all autonomous irreducible self-replicating functions is true, then a gradualistic evolution concept is not a tenable explanation of its origin. And yet, even here, we are dealing with levels of complexity and specificities that are currently vastly beyond scientific understanding, for the most part. How can one not be incomplete, or, by what strongly appears to be the engineering genius of such ultra-sophisticated, unimaginably advanced machinery? And, even more astoundingly, it can even self-replicate, but exactly how is this possible? A very intuitive realization, in principle very disturbing for materialist atheists no doubt. How has this hypothesis been tested so far? Genetic knockout experiments almost completely demonstrate the most minimal self-replicable life form that likely actually can never exist. Can it be empirically refuted? No, not yet, and likely never. Therefore, outside the science room, the possible theological implications of it cannot be logically ruled out, but instead, have become far more believable. There will be of course people who for some reason will want to posit the idea of something possibly alive, existing having a level of complexity somewhere between a very simple machine that can't self-replicate, and the simplest possible known vastly more complicated self-replicating prokaryotic cell, and they are entitled to believe in their somewhere in between amount of self-replicable complexity idea, as an article of blind faith. They are of course currently free to practice their religion, but that piece of fanciful undisciplined imagination, such an incompletely fantasized proto-cell, is most certainly not scientifically established, not by any means, and from what has been discovered it is most likely impossible. There is no scientific basis for the idea. And self-replicating cells are most certainly not just simple bubbles. You hear a lot of claims by people who pretend to know what they are talking about, and who wrongly misapply existing experimental evidence, out of context. In relevant cases, such experiments have shown that prokaryotic cell functions are almost completely irreducible when in a more artificially manipulated controlled environment, and manifestly less, even far less reducible when in an uncontrolled, more natural, environment. And then going from that to the far more sophisticated eukaryotic cells, for naturalistic evolutionism, is an even more horrendous theoretical nightmare, in genuine scientific terms. We must call it out for what it is. Down is a proven fact, conversely, up is an unproven idea, and, for some, a belief system, and in some sense, a very credulous type of naturalistic religious superstition. Scientists in their various fields test, measure, and only scientifically distinguish all things overall tending toward disorganization, when measuring change in the world, and that includes genetic codes, the very reason why inbred animals have more inherent weaknesses and diseases. This is not some fanciful belief system, this has been proven by proper scientific experiments and observations, exhaustive studies in the field. It is just what biologists, like Michael Behe, and others, have been pointing out for a long time. Darwinian processes degenerate life, they gradually destroy complexity over time. It has been observed, measured, proven. Once again, if someone tries to tell you that this isn't always true, they are either deliberately lying to you, or they don't know what they're talking about. It has been said, never confuse education with intelligence. You can have a PhD and still be an idiot. Essentially, the second law of thermodynamics is a convenient way of describing all observable irreversible phenomena of nature in a reductionist way, in isolation, in a theoretical closed system, where no outside energy or information can be added to those systems. We don't see anything in closed systems reversing to get more organized to perform more functions. Nobody has ever seen it happen. But just how unlikely is it? That is the really important scientific question here. Could it ever happen? Could an existing genetic code accidentally become more organized by chance, by serendipity, by fortuitously happy accidents, and also having increased its specified information? So that nature can perhaps then select it. Let alone it ever naturally originating from a prebiotic chemistry in the first place. And, if genetic information can somehow naturally increase, can it happen enough to permit the evolution of life to go uphill, toward more functional complexity overall in an organism, in a specific life form, instead of what we do observe, actual degeneration, decay? For the natural evolution of life to go uphill, nature requires an uphill transformation of increased functional complexity to select in the first place, otherwise it seems it can't ever happen. There are good statistical reasons, mathematical scientific reasons, why we have so far always seen such things naturally go only in one direction, and not the other way. Things are going down, not up. The continually accumulating disorganization and decay is the only change we actually ever observe happening right now. If you are told something opposite, don't allow yourself to be fooled into believing such anti-scientific nonsense. Realize what has already been scientifically demonstrated, that things are deteriorating, and that this applies very much so to Darwinian evolution when properly tested and measured. The facts at times can be so inconvenient for some. So a very crucial axiom for the materialist-evolutionist atheist belief system is the desperate idea that the natural evolutionary processes can eliminate the degrading genetic mutations enough so that life can in some way evolve uphill, naturally select some undiscovered type of mathematically implausible multiple uphill statistical anomalies of functional increase, and somehow counteract the overwhelming amount of actually known deleterious mutations that are observably degrading the system, and then, these wishfully imagined, never before seen, mathematically implausible, multiple uphill statistical anomalies they hope might, somehow, go toward more overall functional complexity. But no one is actually witnessing this ever happening on human timescales, nor in any other scientifically definitive or distinguishable way, which comes as no surprise. It looks impossible. For any true scientific discipline, such unobservability is, undeniably, a very real problem for a materialist evolutionist, for it offers no support for this exclusively naturalistic idea of uphill change, but instead actually tends to powerfully refute it. Of course, if you don't want to believe in an intelligent creator, God, then this implausible, alternative, impoverished, godless belief system might perhaps be all that is left for you to cling to. It is reasonably well understood that genetic code is a very specified language with syntax, grammatical rules and so on. So how could one beneficial mutation, or even very few of them, ever possibly mitigate the vast majority of actually scientifically known deleterious degenerative mutations in a population of organisms? Can natural selection really sort that out in such a way as to make increasing organized complexity possible? How are the most, if not all, of any of these very few beneficial mutations not also representative of specified information having been lost, and therefore degraded? If the vast majority of even the beneficial mutations are now scientifically known to represent genetic decay, in addition to the vastly greater proportion of deleterious ones, then how does this not prevent evolution from ever being a progressive uphill process somewhere, anywhere? Why should not organisms only devolve, degrade over time, from Darwinian processes? The empirical science seems to be telling us that this speculative idea of upward naturalistic evolution doesn't happen, ever, and with no real confirmation bias of anyone's worldview involved in this conclusion, only scientific falsification of this particular Darwinian hypothesis, from cold hard facts. Let's be clear about this. Repeatable observations of every system ever known to science have verified that even though usable energy may sometimes become increased in an open system, it makes no difference whether any system is open or closed when it comes to its functionality. Functional complexity will never naturally increase, but instead will inevitably decrease toward maximum disorganization. In fact, raw energy, being fed in, actually tends to accelerate the degradation of a functional system. Don't let anyone try to deceptively make you believe the opposite of that. This is the scientifically proven phenomenon of nature that the more cognitively dissident within the evolutionist community have refused to acknowledge when dreaming up their incredulous hypotheses. What you believe is irrelevant. What can be experimentally proven or disproven is what is important for science. Facts. But that is not the way some evolutionists view it, and how they often seem to get away with it is truly astounding. The standards of scientific rigor, in some parts of the scientific community, have become manifestly quite sloppy, if to the extent that someone might loosely define them as being scientific at all, in this particular regard. There is a need for far tighter constraints to be imposed on hypotheses than this, otherwise, we are in danger of letting such, so-called, science, become just another, rather bad form of, religion, and that is unacceptable. Unfortunately, the mainstream media is often not enthusiastic about reporting what might appear to some people as seemingly boring and depressing, but is nonetheless an inconvenient scientific fact, that everything is decaying, degenerating, evolving downward, and quite often will instead prefer to pander to the emotional and irrationally perceived need for a false but sensational story about things imaginatively evolving more complex amazing abilities and functions, perhaps alluding to the excitement of the types of things that are artfully contrived and seen in many badly thought out science fiction stories, all because somebody seeking undue attention makes an erroneous claim that they have discovered evidence that supports such an unsubstantiated and falsified idea of upward change, uphill evolution, for which a journalist imagines might advance their career, and then the story is given undeserved publicity. So the general public is not very well informed about reality at all. As a result, people are unaware that they are putting their faith in disproven ideas. How many past civilizations have risen and fallen without being able to overcome their own particular set of wrong ideas? What kind of incompetent and broken down peer review process would allow such absurdity to slip through their net? Ironically, Darwinists or materialist evolutionists are quite often committing worse types of unsubstantiated superstitious nonsense than what they accuse creationists of committing. It's very reminiscent of the ancient Greeks, who imagined that they could have perfect thoughts, and didn't always compare their ideas against reality, unlike those who came along later with the Judeo-Christian worldview, who did not trust their thoughts alone, who believed that they were part of a fallen world, the result of sin, and that therefore human thinking is corrupted, and so they saw the need to check their ideas, by experimenting with nature, to make sure that what they were thinking was right, and from this, modern science was born. However, the atheists and the evolutionists, in some sense, seem to be going down the misguided path that those ancient Greek philosophers often did. But downward change is not boring, for it implies that everything starts in a more sophisticated and functional state, and therefore not only life forms but the entire universe as well. This is something that an exclusively naturalistic worldview cannot explain. How many journalists do you see reporting this aspect of science? It seems that there is a certain intellectually lazy set of people who do not want to elucidate the implications of a more ordered beginning to everything observable. Perhaps it's theological implications. There are two main ways of defining entropy. One way is talking about the ratio of possible organized to disorganized configurations allowed by any system existing or logically imaginable, and that the disorganized amount only increases. And this meets the falsifiability standard, it is testable via experiment. The second way is much the same, but without time. They philosophically remove time from it, and so in this way of looking at it, calling something organized, or disorganized, is said, by such people, to be subjective, therefore invalid. So in this, also subjective, and exclusive, view, that is with the concept of time excluded, entropy is simply all theoretically possible states supposedly allowed, by any system, and are viewed as having equivalent complexities, and any possible functions, within any of those possible states allowed by that system inside of that system, are not acknowledged, as relevant. A kind of willful ignorance. Some materialists might use this way of thinking to keep God out of the picture. In looking for a simpler explanation, this way of doing it turns out not to be simple at all, because the problem then is that such a methodology would not be good for engineering and innovation, so this philosophical type of reductionism is not very useful, under such circumstances. One actual state at least, in a specified system, is manifestly more functional than the far more logically possible less functional states along with the vastly more theoretically non-functional states allowed possible from within that system, the functional distinction of which they had already refused to acknowledge, in that this concept of function over time was excluded from the model. And so when finally realizing the necessity of acknowledging the time component in their model, acknowledging the process, the reality that everything is always changing, and ironically the very irreversible one-way phenomena that their brain and their mental processes were contingent upon to think up this grossly oversimplified type of philosophical reductionism in the first place, there is no getting around it. This unassailable fact has to be acknowledged, that things overall, either become less separated, or less differentiated, and often both, over time, and therefore, in specified circumstances, overwhelmingly many of these states are less functional, vastly most of them non-functional in that sense. Actually, the most fundamental explanation that scientists can provide for such one-way phenomena is by using statistical principles, which, as far as we can tell, according to the workings of our brains, seem to describe the mentally perceived one-way nature of time, itself. Somewhat mysterious. Therefore, in principle, we are logically required to go back to the previous way of defining it, and so required to define order and disorder, so that functional distinctions can be made, that is, scientific progress, and which provides us with a tenable explanation of the observable, one-way direction of change, in the universe. The concept of time is therefore inclusive. Without time, as part of any evolutionary theory, there is only an oversimplified description of entropy, but with time, we have the second law of thermodynamics, the law of increasing entropy, things devolving. And so this model far more correctly describes reality. You need function over time for any of this to make sense. In fact, without acknowledging the relevance of function, or purpose, the ability to use energy or information to perform useful work, there would be no point to it in the first place. The concept of function, or usefulness, is intrinsic to biology and all machinery, for if it could not be viewed as having a function, there would be no point to the second law of thermodynamics. It is not about how many possible configurations for a system there are, it is about the possible types of configurations available in the possibility space of an otherwise functional, or specified, system, either a useful or useless configuration, which distinguishes both it and the entropy. There would be little point referring to it as a system if you could not describe its function, its differentiability, separateness, and specificity, distinguishing it from just plain randomness and disorganization. Consequentially, the most useful way of defining entropy is the measurement of disorder, disorganization, unusable information or unusable energy in a system, which, statistically speaking, is the more highly probable and highest portion of the vast possibility spaces within any and every complex functional system. And as a consequence, we then are bound to acknowledge the unavoidable mathematically described physical law, that such disorder always increases. And this becomes a foundation that many theoretical physicists say more fundamentally describes the one-way direction of time, or the process of which our human brains conceptually perceive as an entity with the name we have chosen for it, time. And more specifically what has been called, the arrow of time. It is theoretically impossible for anything physical to exist without time. It seems that all fundamental particles are oscillating wave packets of energy, which require a conceptualization of time for their relative oscillating motions, seemingly the fundamental essence of energy itself, and of time. If particles don't oscillate, they don't exist. Time, and spatial motion, energy highly organized, which is matter, seem to be intrinsically linked to one another, but the matter relevant to our existence seems manifestly contingent upon the specific organization of motion, fluctuations in a plethora of particular specified discrete spatial volumes, and mysterious variable densities, all fluctuating perpetually in precisely specific complicated ways, and with a built-in paradox of uncertainty that seemingly defies common sense. Beyond what scientists can distinguish by measurement now, great levels of mystery remain, and there is the known, and the unknown, an axiomatic distinction, the very essence of science. Evolution. Change. Over time. You may as well say change over change, comparing the rate of change of one thing against the rate of change of another thing. That is using anything as a clock. You can logically unify change and time, as being the same phenomenon. The real question might be, what is the fundamental explanation of change itself? That may prove to be the most disturbing question of all, instead of why or how there is something rather than nothing. Why, the changing, the fluctuation, or oscillation, of something, or anything at all. And, fundamentally what is it, all that is changing? Perhaps, God only knows, certainly not science. Neo-Darwinists and atheists don't like the implications of the genetic codes in life, being a symbolic language, organized, to perform a function, like words within a paragraph are, because it would strongly suggest that life can only ultimately decay, from genetic copying mistakes, which is opposite, the very antithesis, to the macroevolution idea, and also renders the vague concept of abiogenesis, spontaneous generation of life from non-life, untenable. This is because there is no substantial reason that this statistical entropy principle would not also apply to both somatic and germline mutations, especially when it agrees with the observable degeneration happening in the smaller, isolated, more inbred groups of organisms, whether they are plants or animals. Also, the testable verifiable idea of irreducible complexity, or their minimal reducibility in the functionality of genetic codes and the molecular machines of biology, contradict the materialists' worldview. We know, scientifically, that the genetic codes in molecules have been organized into performing such functions, so the materialist argument becomes manifestly absurd, because statistical mechanics, in principle, can be applied just as much to genetic mutations over generations, as anything else changing over time. Whether scientists will be able to account for this, in absolute quantitative terms, remains to be seen. Some might see this as another favored escape for materialist ideology. A gap of ignorance that naturalistic superstition can survive in. But there is a threshold of improbability at which nature can no longer make anything possible, where the theoretical combinatorial and configurational possibility space in someone's idea can be realized as so large that there is not enough atoms inside whatever literal three-dimensional space for it to ever fulfill that number, not even enough of them within the observable universe, let alone within the region where you wished something might hypothetically happen from chance occurrences. Even worse, if such a posited mechanism has to be irreducibly functionally integrated, for it to even exist, the numbers go astronomically vastly many times further beyond that, as if it wasn't impossible already. So what is really at the heart of this controversy? You might first think that it is primarily about science, but no, it is not. It is foremostly about two opposite belief systems. It is an argument between diametrically opposed worldviews. Those who believe that God exists, and those who claim that they are very doubtful of God's existence. But why is this so? A hardcore atheist and also an agnostic, whether open-minded or not, to the idea of God's existence, might say that they are open-minded when believing it reasonable to consider the possible existence of an infinite amount of other non-identical universes, all containing their own different sets of physical laws, or perhaps many of those universes have some of those same laws and constants as each other but often with different parameters or values. And therefore if this particular type of infinite multiverse idea is real, we cannot absolutely prove that the universe is intelligently fine-tuned, but we can only go so far as to say that it seems perfectly balanced, and from this, it might be reasonable to assume that the vast majority of all other hypothetical universes are not balanced, and have already tipped over, either collapsed out of existence or dissipated out of existence, due to their repulsive and attractive forces, not equal, not balancing out overall. And, the implausibly, very few, remaining, precisely balanced, universes that have not collapsed or dissipated, probably don't have a life-friendly balance of physical laws in them, and so blind indifferent nature is the fine-tuner, that the apparent fine-tuning is only the leftover result of natural selection, a process of elimination, and also our own observer bias, and if this scenario were correct, it would be no surprise that our universe was the universe, or one of the relatively incredibly few, theoretically rare, universes, that turned out right to allow life, as we know it, to exist, only selected by nature, or our observer selection bias, not designed by an intelligence. But, if for some reason you choose to believe this particular picture, how do you get physical laws, and initial conditions, so that such infinite variables are there in the first place, for nature to select from, so that we can end up with this, hypothetically, supposedly highly improbable, serendipitously balanced fine-tuned universe? What creates those laws? What brings about this hypothetical multiverse generator of this notionally vast infinite range of different variable possibilities, to begin with? Or perhaps who would have created such a generator of prototype universes, if it did exist? But are we even asking the right questions? And why, in all of that, have we so far not yet considered that ever-pesky entropy problem, and, for now, completely overlooked it? So let's allow ourselves for a moment to ask, what kind of uncreated creator is more plausible based on the known evidence? If we believe in an infinite amount of other universes instead of an intelligent creator, has that solved the first life, and logically explained a presumed progressive evolution of diverse increasingly complex life forms? when considering the entropy principle. And hypothetically, what random unguided phenomenon could overcome the entropy principle and generate all those other differential universes? How do you get such vaguely imagined differentiation, instead of just equilibrium? If it were quantum fluctuations, then how did they come to be? Because they might need to be there before you can have a multiverse in the first place. Okay, we cannot observe God, nor a multiverse, but we can ask ourselves, which hypothetical creative entity agrees with repeatable natural experience, the law of increasing entropy, increasing disorganization, things always heading toward equilibrium? Why has there never been witnessed the opposite, within nature? Can we allow ourselves to at least be open to the idea that the opposite doesn't naturally exist? And if it doesn't exist in nature, if any highly improbable upward step toward more functional complexity doesn't exist in a significant enough way to reduce, or lessen, the total amount of entropy, especially in a living breathing organism, then perhaps the only remaining explanation for all creation is a supernatural intelligent creator. Surely that question is reasonable. The most fundamental of all questions for science perhaps is, how is there something, instead of nothing? This question, if properly thought through as much as it is humanly possible, will cause a person to lose out on much sleep. But everything physical exists, we know and understand that much. But how is it possible? It seems unanswerable, and yet if there is a reason and an ultimate cause for how anything at all exists, then there must be an answer to it, even if we may never know, or comprehend, such an answer. But we don't even know nor have any real idea whether we would be able to comprehend it, or for that matter whether we will ever be able to completely comprehend even only the question itself, nor can we imagine how any conscious entity possessing intelligence could have a complete answer, unless the entity was the ultimate cause of existence, and logically who was by necessity self-existent, having an infinite past and an infinite future, or if existing outside of time, timeless, also infinite in every other aspect of its being, infinite intelligence, infinite power, infinite complexity, with infinite abilities, with infinite control over whether or not to implement those abilities. And, if 3D space is ultimately just an illusion, perhaps this entity is also spaceless, instead existing in something far greater than space, rendering the concept of infinity meaningless, merely a vague construct, born in the recesses of our limited material brains. Atheists, materialists, will sometimes liken belief in God to belief in fictional characters. But this is just a thinly veiled form of ridicule, and the argument is not well thought out, not serious, but in reality ad hominem, childish, and intellectually lazy. Equivocating belief in an all-powerful God with the belief in unicorns and fairies is logically inconsistent, because when positing a cause for the universe's existence, unicorns and fairies don't qualify as candidates. When comparing the idea of an all-powerful transcendent God against the hypothetical materialist beliefs including macroevolution and abiogenesis, to explain all creation, in light of the entropy principle, a reasonable person would rightfully say that God seems far more plausible for the creation of such a finely balanced and specified complex universe, because the initial conditions required to create the universe, in the first place, must have been ludicrously precise, and wonderfully specified, beyond comprehension. Even for those of us who think the Big Bang theory plausible, with appropriate acknowledgement of the second law of thermodynamics, the unfathomable complexity and specificity of the initial creative cause have been reasonably deduced by physicists as logically necessary in modern cosmology, meaning that, in scientific terms, acknowledging the precision and specified complexity required, even in the initial conditions of the Big Bang theory, is unavoidable. So there are interesting reasons why some people believe that God primarily created everything, while other people claim that only evolution created everything. One belief is from logic, the other is emotional, and perhaps somewhat irrational. For instance, because of all the evil and suffering in the world, it has upset some people enough so that they have concluded, there is no God. Apparently even Darwin might have fallen into this emotional trap of irrationality, due to the sad untimely death of a close family member. But, only from a belief in the idea of uphill evolution, along with the actually observed evil in the world, do people assume this. If you have very little faith at all, not even much scientific belief in the absolute immutability and consistency of the laws of nature, or for that matter even if you do, along with believing there is only a natural reason for the allowance of evil, instead of a supernatural biblical reason, you might have a bleak outlook on life. But what about those who put a degree of faith in the laws of nature? If, like evolutionary scientist Richard Dawkins, you are an atheist, then with cold, hard, exclusively naturalistic logic, perhaps the best you can hope for in life is what he wrote in his book, Unweaving the Rainbow.
We are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. Most people are never going to die because they're never going to be born. The potential people who could have been here in my place, but who will in fact never see the light of day, outnumber the sand grains of Sahara. Certainly those unborn ghosts include greater poets than Keats, scientists greater than Newton. We know this because the set of possible people allowed by our DNA so massively outnumbers the set of actual people. In the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I, in our ordinariness, that are here. We privileged few who won the lottery of birth against all odds. How dare we whine at our inevitable return to that prior state from which the vast majority have never stirred?
Which is all technically correct except for his concluding sentence, which is only his own personal philosophical opinion, and this famous quote is sometimes used at funerals. But then again, many, who, unlike the atheist Dawkins, do believe in the existence of God, the existence of an intelligent creator of a more ordered, more specified, and functionally complex beginning of all the observable organized functional complexities in the universe, and of the universe itself, would probably disagree with Dawkins' concluding sentence, and instead will dare to whine. And so conversely, perhaps it is appropriate to whine about our impending doom, especially if the biblical claim is true, that humans were originally created by God, and designed to live forever, before sin, before corruption, entered the world, and, as a consequence, inherited human genetic decay, from that time on, has guaranteed our inevitable death, and so due to the current inherent condition of humans, they can no longer live forever. If this is true, then perhaps we have every right to be at least a little bit upset about that heritage. Ironically, both atheists and Christians, perhaps inadvertently, can relate to the more technical part of Dawkins' philosophical statement, implying that life and consciousness are privileges that were never earned by us, and also certainly not individually, and that we should be grateful for even having them at all. But grateful to whom, or what, is the question. If we go with the idea that a perfect, all-powerful, all-eternal, almighty God originally created a perfect world, what are the implications? For some who believe in God, another problem with Dawkins' concluding sentence is that it puts a different value on human life than what the biblical perspective does. Dawkins seems to infer, according to his materialist atheist perspective, that we are a super unlikely accident, and so assumes that this is how we determine the logical value of our short, brief conscious existence, whereas, conversely, the Judeo-Christian perspective teaches that human life was originally intelligently created, perfect, and originally intended to be eternal, and therefore far more valuable, hence the need for Christ's perfect ransom sacrifice to redeem the currently lost potential of everlasting life, to restore it to humankind, to legally mitigate the inherent decay, and inevitable death, inherited from the original sin, to cancel all the subsequent corruption out of an otherwise intelligently designed system, and to right all the wrongs, to restore the world to a perfect state, which according to Bible prophecy will be fulfilled once the issue of universal sovereignty has been resolved. And to produce such a sacrifice infers that God values and loves humans very highly. And perhaps far more highly than what Dawkins could imagine. It would seem that the initial creation of eternal humans was an act of infinite will, and would require a perfect source. So from this, it seems the biblical narrative is inferring that before the occurrence of original sin, humankind, the pinnacle of God's physical creation, was at least one phenomenon designed by God that originally had the potential to somehow consistently triumph over the relentlessness of entropy, which, at first glance, perhaps seems like an extraordinary claim, especially for science. While that was a masterful, deliberately provocative, and cleverly written philosophical statement by Dawkins, its scope of inquiry is limited, as such a repartee alone cannot address how DNA nor any other sort of coded information, nor any type of functional complexity in biological systems, began their existences. What entity caused that level of genetic complexity to stir forth from that prior state of maximum entropy? Ironically, one of the most scientific of all questions cannot yet be answered by science. What made it all go the other way, when all we ever scientifically distinguish, meaning if, and when, any natural direction of change is detected, are thermodynamically downward chemical changes toward non-life? If this is all that we ever see happening, then how did it begin more ordered? How did these somewhat irreducible, very far from equilibrium, phenomena, that we call life, begin? This is a scientific question for which we might never have a scientific answer. However, we can provide a partial answer, in scientific terms, to the question, why do we age and die instead of living forever? Actually, in some sense, upon death we return to a lower state from that which we stirred forth. We were generated from many sophisticated reproductive mechanisms that utilized DNA's potentiality, by the systems necessary for life, highly specified biological information with all its associated functional complexity, but we eventually return to a far lower state, the dust, a far more disorganized state, with no biological functionality at all. That is a scientific statement. However, beyond what science can say, the human race, as a whole, somehow was made from this lower state, a state of disorganization, dust. In other words, the human race was built from the elements. But how was such mind-boggling complexity originally produced? Could some form of natural evolution alone have ever been capable of creating it? Perhaps a gradual process over billions of years, or was an intelligent designer absolutely necessary for its construction to ever be possible? And, according to mainstream orthodoxy, is a scientist allowed to bring this question into the science room? It would seem not. So there is a logical need to ask legitimate questions that might go beyond the reach of science. Perhaps for a scientist, the question of intelligent design is not a thought crime, after all. Certainly, the origin of life has so far remained beyond the reach of science. Yet many scientists speak about it as though they are talking science, when in fact they are not. That prior state from which the vast majority have never stirred, was not just dust and disorganization, it was an already vastly complex integrated system of coding and molecular machinery, which was replicating and building life including humans, this already existing highly sophisticated biological casino as it were, and it is not only an origin of life problem, because not only do you still have to explain how that level of complexity came about, that is, how that particular prior state of DNA and molecular machines came to exist, but also how more complex multicellular life was generated from there. Typically, when people speculate about the possibility of life elsewhere in the universe, sadly even scientists, they not only speculate about the idea of abiogenesis but also tend to automatically assume that unguided evolution can build more complex life, and they question the idea probably not as much as they scientifically should. maybe for fear of being ridiculed with the God of the Gaps accusation. This doesn't change the cold hard fact that the empirical evidence for uphill evolution is very weak. From an operational standpoint, certainly nothing definitive. In reality, it is a great scientific hurdle to overcome, and God cannot be ruled out, but perhaps most notably of all is that science has not been able to reproduce such an unguided uphill process experimentally. All observed natural processes have instead been downhill, even in biology. So, regarding atheist Richard Dawkins, his commitment to doubting God's existence remains the ad hominem commitment of some other scientists, which, for the purpose of scientific rigor perhaps, might have seemed somewhat reasonable except for when they ridiculed the very question itself of intelligent creation. We don't see the dust itself, or any kind of chemical soup, generating life. We only observe life getting produced by, and coming from, a previous generation of life. Any ideas that go above and beyond those empirical observations, whether theological or purely naturalistic, nonetheless, are religious. But which perspective goes against that ubiquitously repeatable observation, and therefore more incredulously superstitious? The naturalistic idea of uphill evolution seems to be an obvious violation of empirical science, against the second law of thermodynamics, but the idea of an eternal intelligent designer God seems to also break this entropic rule as well. It's manifestly unnatural, but that doesn't necessarily make the supernatural God idea wrong. It's just outside the scope of science. In this case, there is a logical distinction. Logically, it might be beyond the reach of much scientific investigation and yet, still, be right. It has been scientifically substantiated that nothing natural can go against the second law of thermodynamics. But many, without due diligence, automatically assume, strangely enough, that the ideas of upward, uphill, progressive, Darwinian evolution don't violate this law of increasing entropy, without even questioning why, because they have already been taught, or have decided to commit themselves to believe that God doesn't exist and that the natural world is all that exists. But that particular Darwinian belief in uphill evolution does appear to violate the second law, therefore, unscientific, and because science investigates what is natural, it is wrong, according to both specific types of theology and also science. So how do we distinguish that this really is so? Although scientists cannot provide an answer to many things, to their credit, they are not afraid to at least ask some of the most difficult questions. Of course, by doing so they are often no longer constraining themselves to just purely theoretical physics, but have begun to cross over into historical science, and the unknown. What organizing principle brought forth DNA and its coded information into existence? What made such incredible organization come up out of that random slurry of chemicals? Just evolution, or God? If God did it, it seems reasonable to suggest that he can do it again, and the biblical resurrection doctrine then has more plausibility. In the Bible, at Psalm 103, 10-14, it says about God, "He has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor has he repaid us what our errors deserve. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so great is his loyal love toward those who fear him. As far off as the sun rises from the sunset, so far off from us he has put our transgressions. As a father shows mercy to his sons, Jehovah has shown mercy to those who fear him. For he well knows how we are formed, remembering that we are dust. Yes, indeed, we are built from the elements, formed inside the cooking processes within stars, long ago, according to those scientifically proven very specified natural laws built into the universe. But what organized those very elemental particles into biological complexity, into us included, and into this highly specified genetic lottery of birth? Except for clones or identical twins, the chances of two people being genetically identical is astronomically unlikely, only 1 in 2 to the power 6,400,000. Another conservative estimate might be that the number of possible combinations is 1 times 2 times 3 etc. times 300 equals 3 times 10 to the power 614. In comparison to the number of possible genetically different humans allowed by the DNA, which are 3 times 10 to the power 614, there are only an estimated 10 to the power 120 known fundamental particles in the visible universe, even the smaller of those numbers still so incomprehensibly large that they become meaningless to the human mind. Saying "only" sounds ridiculous, of course. We are speaking the word "only" in a comparative sense, but ludicrous nonetheless. The gift of life and individuality is indeed a privilege. When speaking about DNA's potential, Dawkins says we know this, and even though human DNA does allow for this vast combinatorial possibility space, this incredible potential, how is it that we can comprehend this principle in the first place, even if only in the abstract sense? How did consciousness and human thought begin to exist, so that we have this amazing ability to pose the question? What made it come about? If the current understanding of computers and information theory are anything to go by, it might seem that a programmer, an intelligent designer, would be logically necessary. This idea cannot in principle be easily dismissed, even if one chooses to take the skeptical approach. So try to imagine, if you can, a number represented by a 1, followed by 120 zeros. This is the estimated number of fundamental particles in the visible universe. Now, imagine a number starting with a 3 in front and followed by 614 zeros. This is the estimated number of different possible humans allowed by our DNA. This number is so ridiculously large that, if it were comprehensible, it makes the number of fundamental particles of our universe seem insignificant by comparison. It might be like comparing the size of a fundamental particle to the size of vastly unimaginably many times our universe's size. 10 to the power 494 times the size of the observable part of the universe. Unimaginable, inconceivable. And comparing all of that, 10 to the power 494 times the visible area of the universe to the size of something smaller than an atom, is similar to comparing the unfathomable greater difference in the number of possible humans to the much lesser but still vast number of those visibly universal subatomic particles. Somewhat disturbing. Dawkins of course was musing over the already existing system of possible human genetic combinatorial, that being, the system of how many different ways the variations of traits can be remixed and arranged to create any different possible functional human, already discussed as described by a number that has 614 zeros in it, and so they are possible various arrangements of equal complexity. But this says nothing of how the genetic possibility system which allows these complexities was created in the first place. Also, this does not describe a process of increasing complexity over time, but it theoretically describes a system of variable humans with equivalent levels of complexity. To avoid unnecessarily complicating the analysis of the idea, for reductionist simplification, we deliberately assumed the system to be perfect, even though in reality it is not, so this particular situation is far more complicated, and scientists are bound to realistically discuss some of the unfortunate significant complications, and consequentially we would inevitably consider how these problems might affect our worldview regarding the intelligent design versus natural evolution debate. Dawkins also characterized the genetic combinatorial system as being a genetic lottery. So he is merely questioning what happens within that already existing lottery. But the bigger question of course is, how did the lottery come to exist in the first place? It is all very well to talk about the probabilities that a game of chance would allow in a casino, but it is quite another thing to postulate how the casino itself got built in the first place. Casinos, with all their intricate contrivances, don't just pop into existence by themselves, but much thought and planning by intelligent people are necessary, long before they are even constructed. How much more so, then might it also appear this way for the systems in biology. Unfortunately, the house inevitably wins, and in like manner, so does entropy, and therefore we die. Of course, Dawkins says he does not allow himself to believe in the existence of God, but, one would assume for the sake of scientific rigor, he takes the polemical view that everything is ultimately the product of natural evolution instead, and controversially inferred that we should just accept our inevitable doom, and not whine about it, and be glad for the brief time we have, before our previous non-existence resumes forevermore. But Dawkins' conjecture appears to be wrong, because it appears that the second law of thermodynamics is pointing us in a different direction. Statistics and time only observably run completely one way in all aspects of biology, very much like in everything else that scientists know of, which seemingly points us to a more organized beginning to everything. And this is not a misapplication of the second law, contrary to what many hardcore ideologically driven materialist-evolutionists occasionally try to assert upon the public, in order to prop up their own materialist superstitious notion. We can quite legitimately ask, what if all the many of the different kinds of biology, perhaps the various phyla, suddenly began existing at different moments in time, and in a slightly more organized condition than what they are in now? And so did not start in a simple state like what materialist evolutionists choose to believe. What was, or is, the actual cause of the Cambrian explosion, and the punctuated discrete fossil forms along with all their living discrete counterparts observable now? No matter how we might choose to interpret those fossils, that well-recognized statistical second law seems to point us to a more organized complex start, to all the observable life forms. Faith is the logical extrapolation from the seen to the unseen. Science will only validate mathematical airtight logic. This is ideally the only type of faith that is supposedly allowed within the historical sciences. This type of faith is based on uniformitarian principles, that is, appealing to causes now in operation. This idea is not without its problems, but it is useful. Uniformitarianism, also known as the doctrine of uniformity, is the premise that the same natural laws and processes that function in our present time period in scientific observations have always operated in the universe in the past, and this reasoning is extended to be the same throughout the entire universe. That is why Richard Feynman could quite confidently state, if it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong, the very key to science. And so from that, it seems one might conclude, the ideas about natural evolution going uphill disagree with experiment, and therefore, wrong. Those who do not have faith in this particular uniformitarian premise might reason that the laws of the past universe were different than the present, or that different regions of space might have different physical laws than what we have measured, that is the multiverse hypothesis, but this is unfalsifiable speculation, and because it is untestable, it has no real place in the science room. However, we can examine those ideas philosophically. It was once believed that the empirically based, micro-evolution, might one day be possible in scientific terms to eventually be logically extrapolated uphill, toward, what was in past times an inconclusive idea, the idea of, what was later called, macroevolution. Back in that time, based on the very limited, scientific, information that was available to him, Darwin speculated that small types of changes he observed might have accumulated over vast amounts of time, with other new and novel changes that he imagined, in some way, had perhaps continually arisen, which over time, he wondered, perhaps might have added up to, and therefore explained, the larger differences he observed in life forms selected by nature for survival, and therefore supposedly in all life. It seemed like a rather simple and beautiful idea, one that some atheists thought might provide them with intellectual fulfillment, this believed, macro-evolution. However, with the modern understanding of genetic principles, the macroevolution premise has turned out to be anything but simple, much to the chagrin of die-hard materialists. The actual scientific evidence is overwhelmingly against it. the irrefutable reasoning, the most fundamental of convincing scientific arguments, of all time, never found to disagree with experiments, against this macroevolution idea, is a scientifically based logical distinction, by using this deepest of fundamental arguments, derived from the established statistical entropy principle, which is a well-known scientifically established fact. The logical argument is extrapolated from these very same statistical principles, that life is devolving, that is to say, evolving downward, not upward, the antithesis of much Darwinian thinking. The argument's power comes from empirical observation of evolutionary downhill processes and nothing of any real significance to the contrary. So this appears like a very distinguishing scientifically based falsification of the macroevolution idea, and the most significant of empirical distinctions within the Darwinian theory, which no real scientist can ignore. There is good scientific reason to posit, far from being a system producing equal or more complexity, it is a system that is losing complexities, it is a system like every other system that has been measured and observed. It is a system creating lesser complexities, ultimately heading toward a condition of maximum simplicity, in this case, scrambled to the maximum that the system will allow, before total failure occurs. However, this is still an oversimplified appraisal of the total situation. We can say a lot more about it. What happens when you photocopy an image, then photocopy the photocopy, and copy that previous copy, and so on, generation after generation? Each successive copy is more degraded than the previous copy, they get to be more and more degenerated. Regarding all life forms, that are of course replicating, continually reproducing, a more specifically relevant repeatable scientific fact, that needs to be pointed out here is this: anywhere, in reality, even with human-made technology, we always observe that a copy of a copy of a copy is not always as good as, or certainly not better than, the original, that is not more organized, or never more functionally complex. Instead, any observed differences are that of progressive degradation, when there is no added intelligent input but only made to run its programmed function. This is demonstrably repeatably so, without any proven exception. There is no substantial reason to believe otherwise, within the genetic codes nor any other sophisticated integrated specified molecular mechanisms in biology, as continual successive copies are made. It also seems like a good strong explanation for why we grow old and die. Regardless, the more ideologically driven evolutionists want to believe that there is much freedom in the code to allow improvement, and so they postulate their ad hoc idea of junk DNA being the raw material of a vaguely imagined upward evolution, for the parts of DNA that we don't yet understand, to try and rescue their unconstrained ideas from collapsing in deepest humiliation. In scientific terms, the concept of scrambled junk DNA turning into functional code is an attempted argument from ignorance and incredulity. This particular so-called pet theory of the universe has turned out to be a superstition, because it is in contradiction to all repeatable experiences of nature, so far demonstrated. Some might believe that this situation for science may change in the future, but given the time that has gone by since the birth of modern science, it now seems overwhelmingly unlikely that the vaguely imagined ideas of naturally increasing complexity will ever be proven factual, an experiential and experimental fact, that scientists, in principle, have been forced to face. Everything in nature is heading toward a state of higher probability, heading toward a state of being more random, disorganized, and less functional. Biological decay, and its irreversibility, are as true and undeniable as any other forms of decay, in nature, even when natural selection of genes and mutations are involved. All naturally caused evolution is downhill. If, in the science room, you are told the contrary, that is a deplorable lie, by those who don't want to believe in the existence of God, but against all the evidence want to believe in a simple beginning where order naturalistically arose from chaos, for emotional, irrational motives, not for scientific reasons, because actual science shows us the polar opposite of that denialistic, godless philosophy. Science overpoweringly points to a more organized beginning. Intelligently organized,